Under the burning light of a distant sun, Daniel moved carefully through the dense alien jungle, his boots sinking slightly into the moss-covered ground while strange insects buzzed around him, and bird-like creatures called from the canopy above. Yet none of those details distracted him from the uneasy silence that seemed to hang in the air whenever he stopped to listen. For this wilderness was not like Earth, and he had learned quickly that quiet often meant danger. Still he pressed forward, because he was searching for something that the colony records claimed did not exist, an unknown survivor of a long-forgotten crash, though even he doubted the stories until the moment he saw her, standing barefoot on a stone outcrop, her skin pale with a faint shimmer as though touched by starlight, her long hair tangled like vines, yet reflecting the sunlight in golden strands, and her eyes, wide and intelligent, fixed on him with a mix of fear and curiosity. And Daniel froze where he stood, because the sight was both unreal and haunting, as though the forest itself had shaped her into being. Yet in that instant he knew she was no spirit of the jungle but flesh and blood, someone who had endured alone for who knew how many years, unclothed and unashamed, as though she belonged to this wilderness more than to any world of men. And while Daniel had faced storms, beasts, and hunger, nothing unsettled him like the silence that followed her gaze, because it felt as though the forest itself paused to see what he would do, his every movement weighed and measured by unseen eyes. So he did not raise his voice or step closer, but slowly removed his pack and set it on the ground, carefully taking out a small piece of dried fruit which he placed on a flat stone before stepping back, his heart beating harder than when he had ever faced danger. And the alien girl tilted her head, her expression unreadable, her slender hands resting against her sides as though she could spring away like a deer if he made the wrong move. And minutes passed in unbearable tension, until at last she stepped forward, her movements graceful yet cautious, bending to sniff the food with a strange curiosity before lifting it delicately between her fingers, tasting it. And for the first time her lips curved in the faintest trace of a smile, and Daniel felt the air shift around them as though a fragile thread of connection had been formed. Yet the jungle reminded him it was never safe, for above them a flock of winged beasts burst into the air with shrill cries, and her head turned sharply, eyes darting to the trees as though she sensed something hidden, something that did not belong. And Daniel's hand instinctively went to the knife on his belt, his training warning him that this world was always watching. And though the girl made no move to run, her gaze remained fixed on the shadows of the forest where branches shifted without wind. And in that moment Daniel realized that finding her was not the end of his search, but the beginning of something far more dangerous, because she was not alone in this wilderness, and neither was he. And while the colony had forgotten her, the jungle had not. And now Daniel would have to decide if he would walk away and leave her to the shadows or stay and uncover what truly waited within the heart of this untamed world. Daniel did not sleep that night, for the face of the strange alien girl lingered in his mind, her eyes following him even when he closed his own. And though the forest around his small camp whispered with its usual calls of insects and the rustling of unseen creatures, he could not shake the feeling that he was being watched not by animals but by her, the silent figure who had accepted his offering yet vanished into the trees as quickly as she appeared. And so at dawn he rose early, gathering fruit and filling a container with fresh water from a nearby stream, moving slowly through the foliage with every sense alert, for he knew if he startled her again she might disappear for good. And when he reached the clearing where he had first seen her, he placed the food upon the same flat stone, then retreated to the shadows, waiting with his breath held tight in his chest. And minutes turned into an hour before she appeared, stepping softly from between the trees like a whisper made flesh, her hair tangled with green leaves and her skin glowing faintly in the morning light. And this time she did not hesitate, but walked straight to the stone, lifting the fruit and eating as though she had known all along he would return. Yet before she finished she turned her gaze toward him, and Daniel realized she had always known where he was hiding, her lips parting slightly as though she wanted to speak, but had forgotten how, until at last a single word escaped in a low, halting tone, "Why?" And Daniel stepped carefully from the shadows, his heart pounding, because it was the first time he had heard her voice, soft and unsteady yet filled with a depth that suggested more than simple instinct. And he answered quietly, "Because you should not be alone." Though he doubted she understood all the words, still her eyes searched his face with a sharpness that unsettled him. And she repeated slowly, "Why? Help me," as if she were testing the sound of each syllable. And Daniel realized she could indeed speak, though perhaps it had been years since she last used language, and he nodded, crouching to appear less threatening, pointing at her and then at himself before saying, "Friend," and though his voice trembled, the words seemed to strike something deep within her because she tilted her head and whispered it back, broken but clear, "Friend," and in that moment Daniel felt the invisible walls between them weaken, though the jungle itself did not ease, for the branches above creaked as though some heavy weight moved there, and shadows slithered across the ground like unseen hunters circling their prey, making Daniel tighten his grip on his knife, though he kept his face calm for her sake. And she noticed, her eyes flicking toward the trees, her body tensing as if she sensed the presence that had haunted the forest the night before. And without a word she gestured for him to follow, slipping into the undergrowth with silent steps so practiced they seemed part of her very nature. And Daniel hesitated only a moment before following, each stride pulling him deeper into the unknown. His nerves stretched like wires ready to snap, yet his curiosity outweighed his fear, because for the first time since arriving on this planet, he felt as though he was close to discovering a truth the colony had hidden or forgotten. And as he trailed her through winding paths marked only by her instinct, he realized she had not only survived the jungle, she had become one with it. And whatever secret she carried within her fragile voice might be the key to understanding why this world felt alive in ways that defied human knowledge. But as they reached a place where the trees grew ancient and towering, their roots curling like serpents around buried stone, Daniel noticed strange markings carved into the trunks, patterns not made by animals but by hands that may have belonged to her people. And he felt a chill, for the girl stopped suddenly, her eyes dark with memory as she touched one of the carvings and whispered words in a tongue he did not know, her voice trembling not from fear but from sorrow. And Daniel understood then that she was not just a mystery to be solved, she was a survivor of something terrible. And though the air around them felt thick with unseen watchers, he chose to step closer, laying a hand against the carved bark as if to share the weight of her grief. And when she turned her eyes to him again, there was no fear this time, only a fragile thread of trust that bound them together, even as the jungle stirred with a warning that danger was not far behind. For in the distance a low growl rolled through the trees, and Daniel knew their time of quiet discovery was about to end. The growl echoed again through the towering trees, deep and rolling like thunder hidden in the earth. And Daniel felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise as the alien girl stiffened, her hands trembling slightly though her face tried to remain calm, and without a word she grabbed his arm and pulled him into the shadows, her movements quick yet silent, showing she had done this many times before. And Daniel followed, though his instinct screamed for him to turn and face whatever hunted them. Yet the way she moved told him that confrontation was not survival, at least not here. So he swallowed his impulse and let her lead, weaving through vines and roots until they crouched beneath a fallen tree, where the bark had hollowed into a crude shelter. And there in the dim light Daniel finally whispered, "What is it?" Though he already sensed it was no ordinary predator, as she pressed her finger to her lips, listening, her wide eyes flickering toward the sound of branches snapping above as something heavy moved through the canopy, something that breathed with a slow, guttural rhythm unlike any animal Daniel had encountered before. And he remembered the colony archives that spoke vaguely of the crash survivors and strange attacks that followed, yet no clear details had ever been recorded, as though the officials had chosen silence over truth. And he realized with a sinking weight that perhaps she was not the only survivor, or worse, perhaps the crash had awoken something in the jungle that should never have been disturbed. And while they crouched there, her hand gripping his arm so tightly it hurt, she whispered her name in a broken voice, Leora, as if she wanted him to know it before whatever hunted them found them. And Daniel repeated it softly, committing it to memory because it felt like the first real piece of her she had given him. And as he did so, the creature above released a sound so low it rattled the air. And the girl shut her eyes as if bracing for a nightmare she had lived many times. Then spoke in fragments hunters. They come, always come, and Daniel understood these things had stalked her for years, taking away what little peace she might have found. And anger flared within him, though he kept his body still, for he knew rash action would bring death. And he waited, holding his breath, until at last the heavy movements faded deeper into the jungle, the growls trailing into distance. Yet the silence that followed felt no safer, because he knew they would return. They always returned, and when at last she relaxed her grip, he asked her carefully what they were. But she shook her head, unable to form the words, instead tracing a claw-like shape in the dirt with her finger, a mark that made his stomach knot. With a knees, and Daniel realized her survival here had not been chance, but a daily war against hunters that stalked even in daylight. And though she had endured, she had done so alone until now, and that truth pressed heavily on him. For he could not leave her here to face them again, not when she had trusted him enough to give her name. And so he made a silent vow, though he knew the cost could be his life, that he would not abandon her to this endless nightmare. But even as he thought it, the jungle stirred once more with a distant cry that was not of the hunters, but of something else, something mournful and almost human. And Leora's face turned pale as she whispered words he did not understand, her eyes shining with a grief so deep it silenced him. And Daniel understood that the hunters were not the only shadow haunting this place. There were memories too, buried in the ruins of her past, memories that might explain why she had been left here, and why the jungle seemed alive with secrets that humans were never meant to uncover. And as the day darkened into an uneasy dusk, Daniel realized the true danger was not just in surviving the hunters, but in unraveling the truth that bound this girl to the wilderness, a truth the colony had chosen to forget, but one that now had chosen him. The night fell heavy upon the jungle, the kind of night where the canopy sealed the stars from view and the darkness pressed in like a living thing. And Daniel sat close to the small fire he had dared to build, the flames barely flickering as if they too feared to draw attention, while Leora crouched across from him, her eyes reflecting the light like twin shards of glass, unblinking and watchful. And though no words passed between them, Daniel felt a growing weight in the silence, as if the very trees listened to their breaths. For somewhere in the unseen distance came the sound of snapping wood and low guttural calls, the voices of the hunters moving through the night, circling like wolves that had claimed the forest long before his rival. And his hand tightened around the hilt of his knife. Though he knew the blade was small comfort against such creatures, yet he would not let her see his fear, because she had lived with it for years and still endured. And if he faltered now, he would prove unworthy of the fragile trust she had given him. So he forced his voice steady and whispered that the fire would keep most animals away. But Leora only shook her head slowly, her long hair shifting like shadows, and said in her broken voice, "Not them. Fire no stop them." And her warning chilled him, for he realized these hunters were unlike anything he had faced, not beasts deterred by flame or noise, but predators with patience, intelligence, and perhaps something more, something that had stalked her people long before he ever stepped foot on this planet. And then, as if summoned by her words, the silence shattered with a screech so sharp it tore through the night like ripping metal, and from the trees came the sound of rushing limbs, powerful bodies leaping through the branches with speed no human could match, their movements circling tighter and tighter round the small glow of fire. And Daniel's heart hammered as his eyes darted through the blackness, catching only glimpses of glistening shapes between leaves, eyes that shimmered faintly like burning coals. And he knew they were testing him, gauging the courage of the stranger who had entered their hunting ground. And when one shape finally lunged from the shadows with a snarl, Daniel's instincts took over, and he thrust a burning branch toward it, the flame sparking against a scaled body that recoiled with a hiss, before vanishing again into the trees. But the attack had not been meant to kill, it had been meant to measure. And now the forest vibrated with their excitement, their growls, echoing from all sides as they prepared for a true strike. And Leora gripped his arm, pulling him toward the deeper woods with surprising strength, urging him to flee. But Daniel shook his head, because he knew if they ran blindly, they would be picked off one by one. And so he forced his mind to calm, recalling the lessons of survival and the simple truth that predators feared what they did not understand, and though his knife and fire seemed small, he carried something else no creature of this jungle had faced before: the will of a human who refused to surrender. And so he tore strips from his pack, wrapped them around branches, and lit them, creating crude torches that he planted into the ground in a circle, a ring of unstable firelight, while Leora watched with a mix of awe and doubt, for she had never seen such defiance. And when the hunters closed in again, snarling from the shadows, they found themselves facing not prey cowering in the dark, but a man who had carved a circle of flame against them. And though Daniel's chest burned with fear, he stood tall, shouting into the night words they could not understand, but that carried the raw force of challenge. And the forest seemed to shudder at the sound, as though even the trees themselves took notice. And for a moment the hunters paused, uncertain, their glowing eyes wavering at the edge of firelight. And Daniel realized that this was the difference. This was what Leora's people had lacked: the refusal to bend, the fury to resist even in hopelessness. And he felt her eyes on him, wide and filled not with fear but with wonder, as if she was seeing something entirely new. And though the hunters did not retreat, they hesitated, pacing at the border of flame, growling low in frustration. And finally one released a scream so furious it shook the branches, then leapt away, the others following, their shapes melting back into the night until the jungle was once more filled with only the crackle of fire and the distant calls of harmless creatures. And Daniel collapsed to one knee, exhaustion washing through him, yet Leora knelt beside him, her hand lightly touching his shoulder as though she could not believe what she had witnessed. And she whispered his name for the first time, her voice soft, almost reverent. And he understood that in her eyes he had become more than just a stranger. He had become a shield, something stronger than the jungle itself, though in his heart he knew the fight was far from over, because the hunters had not been defeated, only delayed, and they would return. And when they did, they would come not as cautious shadows, but as furious predators determined to break the human who had dared to stand against them. Yet Daniel welcomed the thought, for now he carried not only his own will, but also the fragile hope of the girl who had lived too long in silence, and that hope gave him strength enough to face whatever dawn would bring. The jungle slowly released its grip on the night, and as the first pale light of dawn seeped through the canopy, Daniel sat in silence, his body aching from tension, yet his mind alive with questions. For though the hunters had retreated, he knew they would come again. And he also knew that to stay in this wilderness meant death, not only for him but for Leora, whose tired eyes betrayed the years of fear she had endured. And as he studied her fragile frame, thin yet unbroken, he realized she deserved more than survival in shadows. She deserved a life where she did not have to glance over her shoulder at every sound. And the thought became a decision, firm and unshakable. He would take her away from the jungle, away from the endless hunt, into the world of humans. Though the risk would be great, for he could not predict how others would see her, whether as a curiosity, a danger, or simply as someone who did not belong. But he believed she had the right to be seen. And so when she asked him with her broken voice, "Why you stay? Why fight?" he answered simply, "Because you are not meant to live in fear." And though she did not fully understand, she stared at him with eyes wide and searching, as if testing the truth of his words. And when she did not look away, he knew her heart leaned toward trust, and that trust gave him strength to act. So at dawn he packed what little supplies he had left, guiding her through the undergrowth with patience, every step bringing them closer to the distant outpost where human settlers lived, though he felt her hesitation grow with each stride. For the jungle was the only home she remembered, and its wild silence had shaped her spirit. And more than once she paused, her body trembling as if an invisible chain pulled her back. Yet Daniel always whispered, "Come, it is safe with me," and slowly she followed, her bare feet silent on the rotes, her eyes watching everything as though she was saying farewell to the forest that had raised her. And after hours of careful movement, they broke free of the last line of trees, and for the first time she saw what lay beyond, the open plain stretching wide beneath a sky too vast to hide in. And she froze, overwhelmed, her hand tightening on his arm as if she feared the sky itself would swallow her, and Daniel spoke softly, telling her this was only the beginning, that she would see more than trees and shadows, that she would see people, but his reassurance did not ease her unease. And when at last they reached the settlement, at the edge of the colony, the reaction was immediate. For the humans there stopped their work and stared, tools slipping from hands, voices breaking into whispers. For never before had they seen an alien girl, walking beside a man, her wild beauty strange and untamed, her eyes weary yet bright, her skin marked by years beneath the sun. And Daniel felt the weight of their stares like arrows, but he did not let her falter, guiding her straight into the heart of the settlement, though every step was a battle against suspicion. And soon someone demanded to know who she was. Another muttered that she must be dangerous, while others watched in awe, whispering that perhaps she was the last of the lost ones from the crash long ago. And Daniel answered them all with calm defiance, saying, "She is a survivor, and she is under my protection." But the murmurs did not cease, for though some looked on her with pity or respect, others saw only a stranger too different to belong. And Leora shrank beneath the weight of their gazes, clutching Daniel's sleeve, whispering in fear that perhaps they were worse than the hunters, for at least the hunters never pretended to be kind. And Daniel bent to her and promised that no one would harm her while he lived. But to prove she could walk among them, he led her into the marketplace, where merchants displayed cloth and tools and food, a world of colors and sounds so different from the green silence of the forest. And Leora's wide eyes darted from stall to stall, overwhelmed. Yet Daniel saw something awaken in her, a spark of wonder hidden beneath her fear, and he guided her to a cloth merchant, lifting a soft woven dress and offering it to her, explaining gently that humans wore such things for comfort and dignity, though he knew for her it would feel strange after a life without such coverings. And she touched the fabric with hesitant fingers, feeling its weight, its texture, before shaking her head in confusion, whispering, "Not me." And Daniel smiled faintly, saying, "Yes, you," for he wanted her to see herself as more than the wild creature the forest had shaped. And after long hesitation, she allowed him to drape the garment over her shoulders, her face flushing with unfamiliar heat as the cloth covered her skin. And the crowd gasped softly at the sight, for in that instant she no longer looked only like a lost survivor, but like someone stepping hesitantly into a new life. And though the whispers around them did not fade, Daniel saw pride in her eyes, mixed with fear and uncertainty, and he knew this was only the first step of many, that she would stumble and struggle, but she would not face it alone, for he would stand with her. And as they left the marketplace with curious eyes still following, Daniel caught sight of a figure in the distance watching them not with awe or suspicion, but with something darker, a cold stare that lingered too long. And unease crept into his heart, for he sensed that danger had followed them out of the jungle and into this place, and that whatever hunted her before was not yet finished, only waiting for the right moment to strike again. The days that followed were filled with uneasy calm, for though Daniel had brought Leora into the settlement and clothed her, though he had shown her food that was cooked instead of gathered, and tools made by hands instead of shaped by nature, he could feel the eyes of the people upon them everywhere they went, some curious, some afraid, and some quietly hostile, and he knew that acceptance would not come easily. Yet he believed that time and patience would help. But in the back of his mind lingered the memory of the figure who had watched them from the crowd, silent and still, with eyes colder than the jungle night. And Daniel felt sure that danger had not been left behind, but had merely changed shape, waiting to reveal itself. And his unease proved true one evening when the settlement alarms rang out, sharp and jarring, sending people rushing to the barricades that lined the outskirts. For the hunters had followed, their screeches rising in the distance, echoing across the plain. And fear spread quickly among the settlers, who had never faced such creatures before. But Daniel felt no surprise, only grim certainty, for he had known they would not let Leora go. And when she heard their cries, her body stiffened in terror, her memories of endless pursuit returning. Yet when she saw Daniel standing firm, she drew closer, her trembling hand finding his, as though clinging to the one thing stronger than her fear. And Daniel turned to the settlers, declaring that they must not scatter, that they must fight as one. For he had faced these predators and knew their ways, but his words were met with doubt, for many whispered that it was her presence that had brought this danger upon them, that she had led the monsters to their walls, and some shouted that she should be cast out, sacrificed to save the rest, and Leora's eyes filled with hurt, her fragile hope crumbling as she realized they saw her not as one of them but as a burden. Yet Daniel's voice cut through the rising panic as he swore that she was not the cause, that the hunters had always been here waiting, and only now dared to strike because they feared what she represented, the survival of a people who refused to vanish, and though some still wavered, his fire gave others strength, and soon men and women stood ready with rifles, blades, and torches, lining the barricades as the jungle shivered with movement. And then the attack came, swift and brutal, the hunters bursting from the shadows in a wave of snarling bodies, their glowing eyes filled with hunger, their claws tearing at the wooden walls. And the night lit up with gunfire and firelight, the settlers, shouting in fear and rage, and Daniel fought among them, his blade cutting, his torch swinging, his voice rising above the chaos, while Leora stood behind him at first, frozen between terror and awe. But as she saw him bleed and struggle, something deep within her stirred, a memory of her lost people, of those who had once stood and fallen, and she seized a spear from the ground, her hands trembling yet determined, and stepped into the fight, her wild cry cutting the night as she drove the weapon into one of the creatures, shocking even herself as it fell. And the settlers round her faltered in disbelief before rallying, inspired by the sight of the alien girl who had lived alone, now standing beside them, and the tide of fear shifted slowly into defiance. But the hunters were relentless, their numbers great, and soon parts of the barricade gave way, sending people screaming back into the streets. And Daniel realized the settlement might not hold, not unless they fought with more than fear, not unless they struck at the hunters' will instead of only their bodies. And so he called to Leora, telling her to guide him to the place of the carvings in the jungle, the place where she had whispered in sorrow, for he believed that whatever bound the hunters to her people might be answered there. And though her face paled at the thought of returning, she nodded, trusting his strength, and together they broke from the defense, racing into the night while behind them the settlement burned with fire and screams, and the hunters sensed their flight, splitting away from the walls to chase them, their shrieks filling the air as branches cracked and shadows leapt. But Daniel and Leora pressed on, their lungs burning, until at last they reached the ancient trees, their trunks carved with symbols of her lost kind, and there the hunters closed in, circling with savage triumph, believing they had cornered their prey. But Daniel lit the carvings with his torch, the flames dancing across the symbols, and Leora stepped forward, her voice trembling yet strong, as she spoke the old words of her people, words she had buried in silence for years. And the forest seemed to listen, the air thickening as though the earth itself remembered. And the hunters froze, their snarls breaking into confusion, for in her voice was not fear, but the echo of a forgotten command. And Daniel realized with awe that these creatures had not only hunted her people, they had been bound to them once, shaped by their will, and those centuries had twisted them into predators. Some trace of that bond remained, awakened now by her defiance. And as she cried out the final words, the hunters shrieked in fury and pain, their bodies twisting as though torn between past and present, and one by one they fled into the night, their cries fading into silence, leaving only the crackle of fire and the heavy sound of Daniel's breath. And Leora collapsed to her knees, trembling, her strength spent. But Daniel caught her, holding her close, whispering that she had done what none could. She had faced the shadows and broken their hold. And when at last they returned to the settlement, weary and bloodied, the people looked upon Leora with new eyes, no longer as a burden but as a savior. For her courage had turned the tide when all else seemed lost. And though whispers still lingered, though suspicion would take time to fade, Daniel knew the bond between human and alien had been forged in fire that night, unbreakable and undeniable. And as dawn rose over the battered walls and smoke-filled sky, Leora stood beside him, clothed not only in fabric, but in a new identity. No longer the silent girl of the jungle, but a survivor who had chosen to live. And though the future was uncertain, She no longer faced it alone, for together they would walk forward, human and alien, into a story that had only just begun.